The auctioneer tried to cheat her, until a stranger spoke up for justice. The auctioneer's hammer fell like thunder on Clara Whitmore's heart. 3 strikes against the courthouse steps, and 20 years of sweat and sacrifice vanished into the pockets of men who'd never worked an honest day. She stood frozen in the crowd, watching her father's ranch, get sold for a fraction of its worth to the same banker who'd orchestrated the whole crooked affair. Sold to Mr. Harrison for $400, called out Ezra Kellum, the auctioneer whose greasy smile had haunted Clara's nightmares for weeks. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, boots scraping against packed earth. Everyone knew the Whitmore spread was worth 10 times that amount. Everyone knew, but no one spoke. Clara's hands trembled at her sides, her mother's worn wedding ring cutting into her finger where she'd twisted it raw. The wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, but all she could taste was the copper of blood where she'd bitten her tongue to keep from screaming. Her father had built this ranch from nothing, stone by stone, fence post by fence post, until it stretched across the valley like a promise kept. Now it belonged to the man who'd forged the papers that claimed her father owed money he'd never borrowed. Any objections? Kellum's voice dripped with mock courtesy. His eyes found Clara in the crowd, daring her to speak. She'd already tried the law. Sheriff Morrison was Harrison's cousin, and Judge Pierce owed the banker more favors than he could count in a lifetime. Justice had a price in Millbrook, and Clara couldn't afford it. The silence stretched tight as a hangman's rope. Clara felt the weight of 40 pairs of eyes, some sympathetic, most just grateful it wasn't their spread on the block. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shawl tighter. Old Pete Morrison spat tobacco juice and looked away. Even Reverend Walsh found something fascinating in his boots. Then the matter settled. Kellum raised his hammer for the final blow. That's when the stranger spoke. "Hold on there, friend." The voice cut through the stillness like a blade through silk, quiet but carrying the kind of authority that made men pause. Clara turned with the rest of the crowd to see a tall figure in a long coat step forward from the back of the gathering. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who'd faced down trouble before and lived to tell about it. His hat sat low over weathered features, but his eyes burned with something Clara couldn't name. Kellum's hammer froze mid-swing. "Auction's closed, mister. You got business here." The stranger tipped his hat to Clara, a gesture so unexpected it sent heat rushing to her cheeks. "Ma'am, name's Gabriel Mason." His attention shifted to Kellum, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I believe there's been some irregularity in these proceedings." Harrison stepped forward, his belly straining against his vest buttons. "This is none of your concern, stranger. The debt's legal, properly documented." "Documented by who?" Mason's voice stayed level, but something in it made Harrison take a step back. "See, I've been asking questions around town. Funny thing about debt papers, they usually get filed with the county clerk. Yours seemed to have missed that step." A murmur ran through the crowd, like wind through wheat. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd checked those records herself, found nothing, but everyone had told her she must have missed something. A woman didn't understand such matters, they'd said. Let the men handle business. Kellum's face flushed red as the sun set. Papers were filed proper. If you can't find them, that's your failing, not ours. Mason reached inside his coat, and Clara noticed how Harrison's hand twitched toward the gun at his hip. But Mason only pulled out a leather folder, worn soft with age. "County clerk in Millbrook's an honest man. Showed me every filing from the past 5 years. No debt papers for Jeremiah Whitmore. But there's something else interesting." He opened the folder with deliberate care, like a man dealing cards in a high-stakes game. "Seems there's a report filed 3 days ago. Someone claiming to have witnessed the burning of certain documents in Harrison's office fireplace. Documents that might have proved embarrassing to certain parties." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the quiet of cowardice. It was the held breath before a storm breaks. Clara felt something fierce and bright kindle in her chest. Hope, maybe. Or maybe just the terrible relief of having someone finally fight beside her. Harrison's face had gone pale as milk. "That's a damn lie. Who filed such a report?" Mason smiled, but there wasn't any warmth in it. Man's got a right to keep his sources confidential, but I reckon the territorial marshal might be interested in hearing the details. He's due in town tomorrow, I believe. The crowd began to murmur in earnest now. Clara saw doubt creeping into faces that had accepted Harrison's version without question. Kellum's hammer shook in his grip, and she realized he was afraid. These men who'd seemed so powerful, so untouchable just moments ago, suddenly looked smaller. Meaner maybe, but smaller. "This auction suspended pending investigation," Mason announced, his voice carrying across the courthouse square like a church bell. "Anyone got a problem with that can take it up with the marshal when he arrives." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but they weren't tears of grief anymore. For the first time in months, she could breathe without feeling like she was drowning. The stranger, Gabriel Mason, had done what no one else would do. He'd stood up to the wolves and made them blink first. But as she watched Harrison's face twist with rage, Clara knew this victory would come with a price. Men like Harrison didn't forgive being made to look small in front of the whole town. And Gabriel Mason had just painted a target on both their backs. The crowd dispersed like smoke and wind, but Clara remained rooted to the courthouse steps, watching Gabriel Mason fold his leather papers with the same careful precision he'd used to unfold them. Her heart still hammered against her ribs, hope and terror warring in her chest like wildcats in a cage. "Mr. Mason." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, barely louder than the evening breeze that stirred dust around their boots. "I don't know how to thank you." He looked up from his papers, and she caught the full weight of his gaze for the first time. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and sharp, set in a face that had seen too much sun and too much trouble. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, white against weathered skin. "No thanks needed, ma'am. Just doing what's right." But Clara had lived long enough to know that strangers didn't risk their necks for righteousness alone. "Why?" she asked. "You don't know me. Don't know this town. Why would you stand up to Harrison and his men?" Mason's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Let's just say I've seen enough corruption to recognize it at 50 paces. He tucked the folder inside his coat and tipped his hat. "You'll want to stay close to town for the next day or two. Harrison's the type to lick his wounds in private before he strikes back." The warning sent ice through Clara's veins. She'd been so caught up in the miracle of someone finally fighting for her that she'd forgotten how men like Harrison settled scores. "What about you? You can't think he'll just let this pass." "I can take care of myself." Mason turned to leave, but Clara caught his sleeve. The fabric was worn soft as her mother's old quilt, and she could feel the solid muscle beneath it. He froze at her touch, and something flickered across his features. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper. "Please." The word slipped out before she could stop it. "At least let me buy you dinner. It's the least I can do." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. His eyes searched her face, like he was looking for something he'd lost a long time ago. Then his shoulders relaxed by degrees, and he nodded once, sharp as a period at the end of a sentence. "Ma'am's got a point. Been riding since dawn, and my horse could use the rest." They walked toward the center of town in silence, their shadows stretching long across the dusty street. The sun hung low and red above the mountains, painting everything the color of old blood. Clara found herself stealing glances at her unlikely savior, trying to puzzle out the man beneath the weathered exterior. He moved like a man accustomed to watching his back, his eyes never still, cataloging every doorway and alley they passed. "You're not from around here," she said, more statement than question. "No, ma'am. Been traveling for a while now." Traveling toward something or away from it? Mason's step faltered for just a heartbeat. "Bit of both, I reckon." They reached Maggie's restaurant as the lamplights began flickering to life in windows along Main Street. The smell of beef stew and fresh bread drifted through the door, making Clara's stomach clench with hunger. She'd been too nervous to eat all day, and now exhaustion hit her like a physical weight. Maggie O'Brien bustled over the moment they stepped inside, her round face creased with concern. "Clara, honey, I heard what happened at the auction. That's a damn shame, Pardon my language. Her eyes shifted to Mason with undisguised curiosity. And who might this be? Gabriel Mason, Clara said. He's the one who stopped the auction. Maggie's eyebrows shot up toward her graying hairline. Well, I'll be. You've got brass, mister, standing up to Harrison like that. Most folks around here learn to keep their heads down where that snake's concerned. They settled at a corner table, and Maggie brought coffee without being asked. The bitter brew warmed Clara's hands through the thick ceramic mug, grounding her in the moment. Across from her, Mason sat with his back to the wall, his hat on the table beside him. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and she found herself wondering what had put those lines around his eyes. You said you recognized corruption at 50 paces, Clara said carefully. Sounds like experience talking. Mason's mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. You could say that. I used to be a lawman. Texas Rangers before. He trailed off, staring into his coffee like it held answers to questions he wasn't ready to ask. Before what? Before I learned that badges don't always make men honest. Sometimes they just make them better at hiding their dishonesty. The pain in his voice was raw as an open wound, and Clara felt her heart clench in recognition. She knew something about betrayal, about having the ground cut out from under you by people you trusted. What happened? Mason was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Outside, a night bird called across the darkening sky, lonely and wild. My captain was taking money from cattle rustlers. When I found out, I reported it through proper channels. Turns out the proper channels were dirtier than the original crime. His fingers tightened around his mug. Good men died because I believed in doing things the right way. Now I do things the effective way. Clara felt tears prick behind her eyes, but not from sadness, from recognition. Here was another soul scarred by the gap between justice and law, another person who'd learned that sometimes righteousness had to be seized rather than given. Is that why you helped me? Because you know what it feels like to be betrayed by the system. Maybe. Mason met her eyes, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. Not pity. She'd had enough of that to last a lifetime. Something fiercer. Something that looked almost like admiration. Or maybe I just can't stand watching good people get trampled by bad ones. He crept up Clara's neck. When was the last time anyone had called her good? When was the last time anyone had looked at her like she was worth fighting for? Mr. Mason, Gabriel. His voice was rough as sand. If we're going to face down Harrison together, might as well use first names. Together. The word sent a thrill through Clara that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with hope. For months, she'd fought this battle alone, watching her world crumble piece by piece while everyone she trusted turned away. Now, suddenly, she had an ally, a dangerous one maybe, with secrets carved into the lines of his face. But an ally nonetheless. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, promising rain. Clara looked across the table at Gabriel Mason and felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for too long. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Whitmore ranch, painting the mountains in shades of ash and sorrow. Clara stood on the front porch where she'd taken her first steps, watching Gabriel Mason water his horse at the trough her father had carved from a single piece of granite. The wood beneath her boots was worn smooth by 20 years of her family's footsteps, her mother running out to greet her father at day's end, her own bare feet racing to feed the chickens each morning before school. Figured you might want to see it one more time, Gabriel had said the night before, offering to ride out with her at sunrise, before the marshal arrives and things get complicated. Now, in the pale morning light, Clara understood why he'd made the offer. This wasn't just about seeing the ranch. It was about saying goodbye to ghosts. She walked down the steps and across the yard, her skirts brushing against the wildflowers her mother had planted along the path. Mexican hat and Indian paintbrush bloomed in defiant splashes of red and yellow, refusing to acknowledge that the woman who tended them was 5 years in the ground. Gabriel followed at a respectful distance, leading his horse, understanding somehow that this pilgrimage required solitude. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, creaking in the morning breeze, like an old man's bones. Clara pushed it open and stepped into the dusty twilight within, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and leather and honest work. Her father's tools still hung on their pegs, waiting for hands that would never return. His workbench bore the ring-shaped stains of countless coffee cups, and Clara could almost see him there, bent over a broken harness, his calloused fingers gentle as a surgeon's. "He taught me everything in this barn," she said, not turning to see if Gabriel had followed her inside. "How to mend tack, how to read the weather in a horse's ears, how to tell good hay from bad by the smell alone." She ran her fingers along the workbench's scarred surface. "Mama wanted him to send me east for schooling, but he said the best education was right here under our feet." "Sounds like a wise man." Gabriel's voice came from just inside the door, quiet and respectful. "Wise enough to know that paper debt doesn't just appear from thin air." Clara's voice hardened. "He kept meticulous records. Every penny that came in, every penny that went out. There's no way he owed Harrison money without me knowing about it." She moved to the back corner, where her father's strongbox sat beneath the loose floorboard. The lock had been broken, the contents scattered, but Clara gathered up the remnants of her family's financial life: receipts, bills of sale, correspondence with cattle buyers from as far away as Kansas City. "Look at this," she said, holding up a letter dated just weeks before her father's death. "Buyer in Dodge City wanting to contract for 50 head next spring." Papa was making plans for the future, not drowning in debt. Gabriel knelt beside her, studying the papers with the same careful attention he'd given the auction documents. His fingers were long and capable, she noticed, with small scars that spoke of hard work and harder living. These records paint a picture of a man building something, not losing it. Question is, why would Harrison want this particular spread badly enough to forge papers for it? Clara sank back on her heels, considering. From here, she could see through the barn's back window to the creek that ran along their eastern border, silver water threading between cottonwoods like a ribbon through her mother's hair. Beyond that, the land rolled away toward the mountains in endless waves of grass and sage, beautiful and empty and full of possibilities. "Water," she said suddenly. "The creek runs year-round, even in drought years, and the railroad surveyors came through last spring, talking about a depot somewhere in this valley." Her pulse quickened as the pieces fell into place. Harrison's not just stealing a ranch, he's positioning himself for the future. Gabriel nodded slowly. Railroad means commerce. Commerce means prosperity, and prosperity flows toward whoever controls the water rights. They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the weight of understanding. Outside, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, the same tune Clara had heard every morning of her life. Soon, if Harrison had his way, other birds would nest in these rafters. Other hands would hang tools on these pegs. The thought made her chest tight with grief and rage in equal measure. "I keep expecting to hear his voice," Clara said softly. "Papa's, I mean. Sometimes I wake up thinking I heard him calling for coffee, or whistling that old cavalry song he learned in the war." She touched the worn leather of his favorite bridle, hanging from its familiar peg. "Mama used to say the dead don't really leave us. They just change the way they speak to us. But all I hear is silence." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "My father died when I was 12, he said finally. Kicked by a horse he was trying to break. For years after, I'd hear his boots on the porch at sunset, coming in from the day's work. Took me a long time to understand that wasn't him haunting me. It was my own heart, trying to keep him alive." Clara looked at him with new understanding. Here was a man who knew about losing the solid ground beneath your feet, about having the world reshape itself around an absence too large to comprehend. "Do you still hear the boots?" "Sometimes." Gabriel's smile was sad as winter rain. "But now I think they're not trying to call him back. They're reminding me to keep walking forward, even when the path gets dark." A horse whinnied in the distance, and Clara tensed. Gabriel was already moving, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip with practiced ease. Through the barn window, Clara could see 3 riders approaching across the south pasture, their horses kicking up dust clouds in the still air. Harrison's men, she breathed. Gabriel's jaw tightened. Seems they couldn't wait for the marshal after all. The peaceful morning shattered like glass around them. Clara's goodbye to her ghosts would have to wait. The living had come calling, and they carried guns. The 3 riders reined up in Clara's yard like they owned it, which maybe they thought they did. Clara recognized the leader, Jake Morrison, the sheriff's nephew, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his stupidity. His companions were cut from the same cloth, hired muscle with dead eyes and quick trigger fingers. "Miss Whitmore," Jake called out, his voice carrying false politeness that fooled no one. "Heard you had some trouble at the auction yesterday. Thought we'd ride out. Make sure you're settling into the idea of moving on." Gabriel stepped from the barn shadows, his movement fluid as water, deadly as a rattlesnake's strike. "Lady's not alone, boys. Might want to reconsider your business here." Jake's hand drifted toward his gun, then stopped as he got a good look at Gabriel's eyes. Even stupid men could recognize death when it stared back at them. "You're that stranger from yesterday, the one stirring up trouble where it don't belong." "I'm the one who believes in fair dealing," Gabriel replied. "You boys got business with Miss Whitmore. You can conduct it proper-like, or you can ride on back to town." The tension stretched tight as fence wire between them. Clara felt sweat bead on her neck despite the cool morning air. 3 against 1 were bad odds, even for a man who wore his gun like Gabriel did, low on his hip, handle worn smooth from use. But Jake Morrison wasn't known for backing down from fights, especially when he held the numbers. "Tell you what," Jake said, his smile turning ugly. "Why don't you and me have ourselves a drink at Murphy's saloon? Talk this over like civilized men. No need to involve the lady in men's business." Clara started to object, but Gabriel's slight shake of the head stopped her. "Sounds reasonable," he said, "but the lady comes with us. Her ranch, her business. Suit yourself." Jake spat tobacco juice into the dust. "But don't say we didn't give you a chance to walk away clean." They rode into town in formation, Jake and his men in front, Gabriel and Clara following at a careful distance. The saloon squatted at the end of Main Street, like a toad in the dust, its batwing doors already propped open despite the early hour. Murphy's was the kind of place where honest folk didn't venture after dark, where Harrison's men conducted business that wouldn't bear scrutiny in daylight. Inside, the air was thick with stale tobacco smoke and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. A handful of men sat at scattered tables, their conversations dying as the group entered. Clara had never been in a saloon before. Respectable women didn't, but she held her head high and followed Gabriel to a table near the back wall. Murphy himself served the drinks, his hands shaking slightly as he poured. Everyone in town knew what happened to bartenders who overheard the wrong conversations. Jake raised his glass in a mock toast. "To new ownership," he said, his eyes fixed on Clara, "and to folks who know when they're beat." Gabriel didn't touch his whiskey. "Funny thing about ownership," he said conversationally. "Been thinking about those debt papers that supposedly went missing. Amazing how documents can just vanish when they're inconvenient." Jake's smile faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means I did some asking around last night. Turns out the territorial marshals been tracking a pattern of fraudulent land acquisitions across 3 counties. Same method every time. Forged debt papers, quick auctions, properties sold to shell companies that trace back to certain prominent businessmen." Clara felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Gabriel had been busy while she slept, piecing together a puzzle bigger than just her family's ranch. But the look in Jake's eyes was turning from swagger to something much more dangerous. "That's a serious accusation, stranger. It's about to be a serious investigation." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, but Clara noticed his right hand stayed near his gun. "See, I used to be a Texas Ranger. Still got friends in the service. They're very interested in patterns like this." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Clara realized that every man in the saloon was listening now, pretending to drink while straining to catch every word. Information was currency in a town like Millbrook, and this conversation could buy a lot of favors. Jake's face had gone pale beneath his stubble. "You're bluffing." Gabriel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Am I? Tell you what, why don't you ride back to Harrison and ask him if he wants to bet his entire operation on that assumption?" One of Jake's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, leaned forward. "Jake, maybe we should." "Shut up, Cody." Jake's voice cracked like a whip, but Clara could see doubt creeping in around the edges of his bravado. Men like Jake were used to being the predators, not the prey. Having the tables turned was unfamiliar territory. Gabriel pulled out his leather folder and laid it on the table between them. "These are copies of reports filed with the Territorial Marshal's office. Details about Harrison's land acquisition methods, witness statements, financial records that don't add up." He opened the folder, revealing neat rows of documents. Amazing what people remember when they think justice might actually have teeth. Clara stared at the papers, her mind racing. When had Gabriel gathered all this evidence? How long had he been planning this confrontation? More importantly, who was Gabriel Mason really, and why did he care so much about one woman's fight for justice? Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against rough wooden floors. "This ain't over, stranger. Not by a long shot." "No," Gabriel agreed quietly. "It's not. But when it is over, Miss Whitmore will have her ranch back, and Harrison will have some explaining to do to a federal judge." As Jake and his men stormed out, Clara turned to Gabriel with questions burning in her throat, but the look in his eyes stopped her cold. This wasn't just about her ranch anymore. This was about something deeper, something personal that Gabriel carried like a wound that had never properly healed. Outside, thunder rumbled again, closer this time. The storm was coming whether they were ready or not. The marshal arrived with the dawn, his badge glinting like a promise in the early light. Clara watched from the hotel window as Marshal Thomas Brennan dismounted in front of the courthouse, his weathered face set in grim lines. Behind him rode two deputies, their rifles gleaming in the morning sun. Gabriel stood in the shadows of the hotel porch, but Clara could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a forge. "Time to finish this," he said quietly. They walked together across the dusty street, Clara's boots marking time with Gabriel's measured pace. Already, word had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts with unusual vigor, their eyes darting toward the courthouse. Women lingered at their washing, straining to catch fragments of conversation. Even the dogs seemed to sense that something momentous was about to unfold. Marshal Brennan was a man carved from granite and hard experience, his mustache white as winter frost. He studied Gabriel with the careful attention of someone who recognized his own kind. "You'd be Mason. Got your wire last night. Makes for interesting reading." "Marshal." Gabriel touched his hat brim. "This is Clara Whitmore, the woman whose ranch Harrison tried to steal." Brennan's eyes softened slightly as they shifted to Clara. "Ma'am, sorry for your troubles. But if what Mason here claims is true, we're about to set things right." The courthouse filled quickly as news spread. Clara found herself seated in the front row, Gabriel beside her, facing the bench where Judge Pierce sat with obvious discomfort. Harrison entered with his lawyer, a nervous little man who kept wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. The banker's usual confidence had cracked like paint in hot sun, revealing something ugly and desperate beneath. "This is a travesty," Harrison declared, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom. A respected businessman being harassed by a drifter with forged documents and wild accusations. Marshal Brennan stood slowly, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. "Mr. Harrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and theft by deception." He pulled out a warrant, the official seal dark against cream-colored paper. Evidence collected from 3 counties shows a pattern of fraudulent land acquisitions totaling over $40,000. The courtroom erupted. Clara felt Gabriel's hand steady her as the world seemed to tilt around her. After months of being told she was wrong, crazy, unable to understand business matters, vindication tasted sweeter than honey and twice as overwhelming. But Harrison wasn't finished. His face had gone purple with rage, spittle flying as he pointed an accusing finger at Gabriel. "You want to know who your champion really is, Miss Whitmore? Ask him about the bank robbery in Amarillo. Ask him about the 3 men who died because Gabriel Mason couldn't tell the difference between justice and revenge." The words hit Gabriel like physical blows. Clara saw him flinch, saw something die behind his eyes. Around them, the courtroom had gone silent as a tomb, waiting for his response. "It's true," Gabriel said quietly, his voice barely carrying past the first row. "I was tracking a gang that had robbed banks across Texas. My captain ordered me to bring them in alive, but when I found them—" He stopped, his jaw working soundlessly for a moment. "They had a hostage, a little girl, maybe 8 years old. The leader said he'd kill her if I didn't back down." Clara's heart clenched. She could see the pain etched in every line of Gabriel's face, the weight of old choices that had carved themselves into his soul. "I tried to do it by the book," Gabriel continued. "Tried to negotiate, to find a peaceful solution. While I talked, they put a bullet in that child's head and laughed about it." His voice hardened. "So I stopped talking and started shooting. When the smoke cleared, all 3 were dead. The girl was already gone." The silence stretched like a held breath. Clara understood now why Gabriel had left the Rangers, why he carried himself like a man running from ghosts. He'd learned the same lesson she had, that sometimes the law and justice pointed in different directions, and a person had to choose which one they could live with. "The difference," Gabriel said, looking directly at Harrison, "is that those men deserved what they got. You're just a thief in a fancy suit." Marshal Brennan cleared his throat. "Mr. Mason's past is his own business. What matters here is the evidence against Mr. Harrison, which is substantial and documented." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'll need you to void the auction of the Whitmore property pending full investigation." Judge Pierce nodded reluctantly. "So ordered. The property is returned to Miss Whitmore pending resolution of all charges." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were tears of relief rather than sorrow. Her ranch was safe. Her father's legacy would continue. Justice, however delayed, had finally found its way to Millbrook. But as the crowd began to disperse, Clara noticed Gabriel slipping toward the door. She caught up with him on the courthouse steps, her hand finding his sleeve, just as it had that first day. "Where are you going?" Gabriel's smile was sad as autumn rain. "Job's done here. Time to move on." "What if I asked you to stay?" For a moment, hope flickered in his eyes like candlelight in wind. Then it guttered out, replaced by something that looked like regret. "You deserve better than a man with blood on his hands, Clara. You deserve someone who can give you the kind of life your parents would have wanted for you." Clara stepped closer, close enough to smell the leather and sage scent of him, close enough to see the pain he carried like stones in his pockets. "What if what I want is a man who knows the difference between justice and law? What if I want someone who'd stand up for what's right, even when it costs him everything?" Gabriel cupped her face in his calloused hands, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Clara, stay," she whispered. "Help me rebuild what they try to destroy. Help me make the ranch into something Papa would be proud of." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face like he was memorizing it. Then he kissed her forehead, gentle as a benediction, and stepped back. "I'll think about it," he said. "But first, I've got some ghosts to make peace with." Clara watched him walk away, his long coat billowing in the wind. But something in his step looked different now, lighter maybe, as if laying down his burden of secrets had freed him to consider a future he'd never dared imagine. Above them, thunder rolled across the sky, but this time it sounded like promise rather than threat. In a world where justice and law often pointed in different directions, Clara Whitmore had found a man who understood the difference. Whether he'd choose to stay and help her write the next chapter remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, she dared to hope the answer might be yes.